Howdy, everybody. Sorry to be late. I am Jemmy today.
Here we are.
Give me a sec. I'm hosting.
You were Jemmy this morning, too.
That's right. Jemmy's taking a few days off. Much needed.
Good for her.
All right, we'll start in just a moment.
And that is a lovely sweater. Did you make it?
Thank you, Cheryl. I did not. I think Woolrich made this one.
I
could.
I know you could. I made a sweater like that once, but then I made it too big for me, so somebody else has it now.
Yeah, a lot of my sweaters just end up with whoever fits into them.
Hey, Lenny, how you doing?
I don't think he heard you yet.
I can hear you.
Yeah, Lenny, how you doing, man?
All right, how you doing?
How you doing? How you doing?
I sit here by myself all the time. I have to get into gear to talk to people.
Yeah. Sarah, how's it going with you?
It's going okay.
Good, glad to hear it.
Yeah,
I'm
everything's
getting my
been
New
good.
York back.
The sun is shining. How are you doing?
I'm fine. Couldn't be better.
All right, surprise. I am not Jemmy.
Why does it look like you're Jemmy today?
Because Jemmy's taking a few days off, and there's some of the Zoom classes that are associated with her name. She's the host, so she had to give me her login information. So okay, so Baal Shem Tov. I found this to be this was a difficult chapter, but with some incredible passages. So I want to share a bit of Baal Shem Tov on the Torah with you, and then we'll jump into the book itself. 1 second, let me just find where I am on Safaria. Okay. Now, okay, so again, we're going to start with the Baal Shem Tov on the Torah, which is something I had intended to do for some time, but I keep not doing it. And it occurred to me today that if I choose a short teaching, and if we do it at the beginning of the class rather than trying to wait for the end, then I have a chance of actually getting it to you. So this is the Baal Shem Tov. I'm just bringing it up in the Hebrew just because, for my sake, not for your sake. It's not translated, but it's an easy teaching to understand, at least on the shot level. And it actually reflects something that we talked about, I think, last time or maybe the time before. But so just I want to teach you. One of the things I'm trying to convey to you is just share with you some of the names of the people in the circle of the Baal Shem Tov, because as I've said many times now, when somebody says this is the teaching of the Baal Shem Tov, most of the time they mean that it's a teaching that was conveyed by one of his students. So in this case, this is from Ben Porat Yosef. I don't remember the teacher that's associated with this work, but Ben Porat Yosef is the citation here. So this is He claims something that he heard from the Baal Shem Tov, and there's no reason to disbelieve him. But in any way, he's talking about this week's Torah portion where it says, he's talking about this verse. So in Exodus 13, when it begins talking about Passover, it begins talking about Pesach and the rules for Passover. So this is just before the Exodus, but God is preparing them. It says, Matzot yechal et shevet hayamim, eat matzah these 7 days. V'lo yer'e lecha chametz, and no chametz, or no leavening shall be found with you. V'lo yer'e lecha se'or b'chol gibelecha, and no leaven shall be found in any of your territory. Okay, so that's not news. We're familiar with that. And actually, I'm just curious. I want to see one thing here. Right. Okay. So you see that the word chametz, this is another one of the amazing things about Sefaria, by the way. They now finally have built various dictionaries into it. Chametz and chametz sometimes can mean to crush or to press as well, and so it can be associated with cruelty or oppression, so that might be in the background of this teaching, which I'll now share with you. And again, sorry, this is only
Rabbi, would you increase the font size, please?
Yeah, you betcha. Is that okay?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, so I'll just translate it to you for you. So I have written in another place when he says I have written, the Ben Parat Yosef, the author, about the verse, and then he quotes the Song of Songs. So let's go to the Song of Songs verse that he quotes. So here's Song of Songs. So now remember, the Song of Songs is in rabbinic reading is very different from whatever it is on the Pshat. But in any event, Imlo ted'i lach hayafa v'nashim, if you do not know, O fairest of women, tzi lach be'ikvei hatzon, go follow the tracks of the sheep. Literally, go follow the ankles of the sheep, but idiomatically it means the tracks of the sheep. Uri et geditayich, and graze your kids, your baby goats, al mishkanot haroim, by the tents of the shepherds. Okay, so totally not connected verse in any way to the Torah portion, and he's not even going to necessarily try to connect it, but he's just saying he made a similar comment to this one elsewhere. So he cites that verse. So he hasn't said anything about it yet. And then he says, your Mishnah, and the Mishnah teaches us in Pirkei Avot, which we could pull up here, in Pirkei Avot, chapter 4. Let me just see if it pulls it up real quick. Yeah, it's actually at the beginning of the parsha. So then he quotes Pirkei Avot, Ben Zom Omer Eze Chacham Halamed Mikol Adam, one who learns from every person. One who learns from every person. That's who is wise. So a wise person is not somebody with all the answers who sits on a mountaintop, but a chacham is one who learns from every person. Okay. Then finally he's going to bring it around. Ki baro'e chesron zulato, when one sees some deficiency in another person, yargish ba'atzmo l'tekein chesrono, he should feel within himself the desire to repair the same insufficiency within him, within oneself. Okay? So you see some deficiency within me, rather than saying, oh, Rabbi Rose, I need to, tell you that you're this and you're that, and hopefully you'll work on it. Rather, you should see that reflected in yourself and say, oh, Rabbi Rose is does such and such annoying thing, or painful thing, or mean thing, or unkind thing. I should fix that within myself, right? That's how you should think about it. V'zeha katuv lo yireh lecha chametz. And he says, and this is the real meaning of the verse, or this is the meaning of the verse. No leavened bread shall be found with you. So there are a couple things going on here. But that's the essence of the teaching. If you see a flaw in another person, use it as a way to perfect yourself, right? You rather than say, "Oh, that person," you say, "Oh, humanity has this within it." Like Shekhinah, the realm of the human, of the divine aspect, has to have this, has this imperfection in it, and the only way I can work on it is by addressing it with myself, right? What a beautiful way to respond to things that we see as errors in the world. Although if we all did this, social media would immediately evaporate, because social media is animated by the desire to tell other people how horrible they are. But anyway, so then just to show you how how this is actually connected to the verses. So one thing is, I think in the Song of Songs, I think one of the things that is going on with this verse, but I'm not sure. But first of all, in lo ted'i, if you do not know. That is, if you don't know about your own imperfections, I think is how he's creatively interpreting this, then go, in other words, go out to others. Okay? So if you don't know what to focus on yourself, then go out to others and learn from them, right? Reading this very creatively. And then he says, go to then the verse says, by the tents of the shepherds. Now the words ro'im, the word ro'im, shepherds, it looks like the word for wicked ones, ra'im, right? Resh ayin is the word ra, or wicked or evil. So I think maybe what he's doing is he's playing with the idea of ro'im and ra'im. So in other words, if you don't know what to work on yourself, go out to the ra'im, go out to other people who have flaws or who are bad news, and learn from them, because you'll see something in them that surely exists in you, and then you know what to work on. So that's one thing. And then the other thing, just on the a little closer to the Peshat, not quite the Peshat, is lo yireh lecha chametz. The no leaven shall be found with you. We might expect that to say with the Jewish community, you shouldn't have any leaven, but actually, surprisingly, it's in the second person singular. Lo yireh lecha, like you. This. Hold on, Harvey, in a second. As an individual, you should not have chametz. And so they turn the search for chametz into a much deeper spiritual search, and they say that this is how the Jewish people will get rid of the truly damaging chametz, is by each person looking within themselves when they become aware of errors of other people and perfecting those. Okay, let's see. One person chatted, and then yeah, Sarah, I'll come back to your comment, your chat in a second. Harvey, what's up?
Okay, so what it's saying then in essence is that during Pesach, let go of cruelty. Do not be ruthless during these 8 days of Passover, because that is the leaven. Another way of translating leaven.
Well, right. I mean, I think he's. I mean, I made the connection to the word chametz, cruelty and oppression. He's speaking more generally. I think he's taking chametz to mean any imperfection, not just cruelty. I mean, it's not clear. He doesn't specifically say that, but it seems to me he's just maybe using that as an entry to say any bad thing that you see in other people, is within yourself, and you should root it out.
So like a reverse projection.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. A reflection. Yeah. See other people as a reflection. Yeah. So Sarah, you made a comment about something I said, I think referring to something I said earlier today, when Rashi says, connects the word Ra to the Egyptian god Ra.
Rashi said that too?
I thought Oh, you didn't hear me say that this morning. Well, it's actually in the Midrash. So in the Torah portion, at the beginning of the Torah portion, Pharaoh says that there will be ra neged einecha, like you'll encounter suffering along the way if you do this. And the Midrash and Rashi understand the word ra, evil, to be reference to the Egyptian god. That is, Pharaoh believes that the Israelites are going to be overpowered by the sun god Ra. But yeah, so very good. See, you could, if we ever stop reading Rashi,
You could read Sarah.
we're gonna lean on you. Okay, let's talk about the Amidah Tefillah today. So we're at chapter 9. Okay, so I just chose a few that I want to talk to you about that I thought I might have something to say. Whoopsie! Now you can't see me when I show my computer. I've got too small a desk here, so I kind of struggle with how to manage all this. All right. So let's turn to page 153. So this is, I think, a really profound teaching, that if you could just master this in tefillah, it would transform how you pray. I'll give you a minute to look over it. It's on 153 and the top of 154. Okay, so this is actually a little confusing, and so let's look at what it says. So the Pirkei Avot, Ethics of the Fathers, says, don't be, well, in their clumsy wording, be not like servants who serve the master in order to receive recompense or reward, is how it's usually more simply translated. Rather, be as servants who work for the master without the thought of reward or recompense. Okay, so in other words, don't serve God because you want a reward. Don't cling to the truth because you want to be thought of as wise, or you want life to go well for you, or you want to have more peace or whatever. You serve God because you serve God without any thought of reward. And actually, I don't here too. The translation stands a little bit in the way. So let me just find the Mishnah. Sorry here, Pirkei Avot. Give me 1 second. Where's Zeraim? There it is. Okay, so and I think I'm belaboring this because I think his teaching is complex enough that it will be very helpful to understand what the literal words are here that he's quoting. So, al tiyeh ka'avadimamishamshim et harav al manat lekabel pras. Do not be like those servants who serve the master al manat, in order lekabel pras, to receive a reward. Okay, so he really changes it a lot in his translation. Ele, rather, hevu avadim, be like those servants, hamishamshim et harav, who serve the master, shelo al manat lekabel pras, not in order to receive a reward. Okay, so it's not really about thought; it's just about whether you do it to receive a reward or not. Same idea though. Okay, now. Then he says, and this is where it gets like your eyes blur over because it seems like he's being overly technical. Now I'm back on 153. There's another version of this Mishnah which rather than says don't do it in order to receive a reward, it actually says do it in order not to receive a reward. Okay, so now normally, so first of all, why is there a different version of the Mishnah? Well, the truth is we have a lot of variance in different texts that come down to us from the rabbinic era, and that's just that just happens when because somebody heard a text or studied it and then made a copying error or had a slightly different tradition, and essentially these mishnayot, whether it's worded um, uh, uh, not in order to receive a reward, or whether it's worded in order to not receive a reward, these mishnayot are understood as normally as being totally redundant. It's just the same idea. Okay, you got the basic idea. But he says actually this variant strain of the Mishnah that says in order to not receive a reward actually is a very different teaching that's very important. Okay, so that's the setup. So then he begins with the first level, which is how he translates the Mishnah and how it's conventionally understood. And he says that so just exactly as you would think. So when you do avoda, when you do divine service, whether it's in prayer or Torah study or just by living your life in a good way, that you should try to do it for the sake of heaven, l'shem shamayim, for the sake of heaven, and not to gain some advantage. Okay, that's the conventional understanding. Thus far, that's probably something we all would understand. But then he says, but there's a higher level to this that's represented by the Mishnah that says, do it in order to not receive a reward. And he says that that really what this means is that if we are using our prayer for the fulfillment of some earthly desire, then what happens if that becomes fulfilled? Then what do we do? But you want to be like a person who is more interested in the process and being in relationship with God than in seeking out that reward, right? So he says, the very bottom of 153, I guess I'm 4 lines from the bottom, the last word. Now this person whose desire and will is to always be in concourse or in conversation with the king, when such a one comes to speak to the king of one's request, she or he would actually be in dread that this desire be granted, so as to go away satisfied and fulfilled. For what then? I'm on 154 now. For what then would such a one have to say to the king? It's an incredible teaching, because it says that the only worthy goal is really to be in relationship with the divine, and that any finite object, like my desire for such and such an income or such and such a relationship, or I want to get this job, that if that's the goal, when it's fulfilled, then what? Then you're filled with anxiety because you have nothing else to reach for. And so it's not accidental wording that it says those who pray in order to not receive a reward, because they don't want the reward. They want to be in relationship. Does that make sense? Questions, comments about that? So, yeah, Lenny, go ahead. You're muted. Oh, go ahead. No, you're not muted. Go ahead.
Maybe I'm just bringing some polemics in there, but you're saying that you actively go and pray and say, Hashem, don't give me this?
Well,
that's what it sounds
right.
like.
I mean, yeah, I think that I think he's using that as a leaping off point. Right. Yes. I think he's saying, look, you have this Mishnah that if you understand it literally, it's weird. You have a person praying to not get whatever he wants. And so why might that be? And then he uses that to open up this idea that if you're praying for something that can be exhausted or finalized or completed, then what? What are you really praying for? Right? Then there's no larger meaning. What came up for me with this, Harvey, I'll get you in 1 second. What came up for me is I actually had an experience of this that was different, but I think it gets to the same idea. So for a while, I was really under the sway of, now I'm spacing out on his name, Yudalev Ashlag, who was a mid 20th century or early mid 20th century Kabbalistic teacher. Amazing human being, and really incredible. But he gives a reading. He kind of boils down the Zohar to its essence, and he did a Hebrew translation of the Zohar with a commentary. It's an unbelievable accomplishment. And in his commentary, he tries to sort of, I don't know if he would say simplify, but he tries to get to the essence of what is the Zohar really saying. And it's extremely powerful and intoxicating. But I also realized that the interpretation is so final and complete that it's like once you get his main idea, why would I read the Zohar anymore? It's all he kind of argues like the entire thing is about overcoming. Ashlag says it's entirely about overcoming your own desire to receive. He says every created being is, by nature, what a created being is it's something that wants to receive, whereas God's nature is just wants to bestow. And so as long as we're in the mode of wanting to receive, we cannot come close to God because our natures are different. But if we overcome our nature to become beings who want to just give, and it might start at the lowest level of tzedakah, but eventually we just want to give ourselves over entirely to the world and to others, then we're letting God in because we're becoming like a similar form to God in our essence. Anyway, without getting stuck on that, that's his magnificent interpretation of the Zohar. But once you have that, I found like I didn't want to read the Zohar anymore. And so what's so powerful is that the Baal Shem Tov, through this teaching, I'm just trying to see whose it actually is. Well, what he's saying is that sense of incompleteness that we might feel from prayer. Like I wanted to see God's face, or I wanted God to, get rid of my tsuris, or whatever it might be. While that approach to prayer is understandable, it actually misses the point, because the point is simply to be in communion with God. Harvey, did you have a comment?
Yes, I think that he overstated the case. They say when an artist does a painting, he has to know when to stop. And he should have stopped a sentence before that, saying basically, you want to be in communion with God, and that's it. If I focus on, I don't want a reward for this, I
Right.
don't want a reward for it,
Right.
then I get preoccupied with not wanting a reward for it.
Right. I think that's great. That's a nice point, and we'll come to a teaching that's a little bit like that in a moment. But it reminds me of that idea in a moment. Cheryl, go ahead.
I just love this, and I don't see the not wanting a reward as being confusing, because what it makes me think about is simplest example would be like I'm reading a book, and I love this book so much that when I get to the end, I don't want it to be the end.
Right.
I don't
Exactly.
want to find out what happens. I want to keep reading the book. Or sometimes, I'm warning you, sometimes with rabbis, I have questions, but I don't really want the questions answered. I just want to talk to the rabbi.
Right.
So-
Exactly. Right.
So
Yeah.
when I get the answer, that's no good, then I have to stop talking. So,
Right. Exactly.
to me,
And what could be more
actually, they
Jewish than
not
that?
wanting it is important.
Yeah, absolutely right. I know like what could be more Jewish than that is what I said. Right. I mean, I do think that there's something, and it's, we could go deeper with this, or maybe it's not deeper. Maybe we could go more sideways with this. I do think that one of the things that I think there's a tension within Jewish life, within Jewish community. There is an approach to Judaism which sort of says like, forget all the conversation. Just tell me, what the hell do I do? Like, how long do I have to wait between eating a hamburger and a cheese sandwich? Like, what's the deal? And there's just the Shulchan Aruch Judaism, which is just the like, what are the rules? Tell me, and I'll do it. Like, that is what it's about. And of course, I'm certainly not saying those things are not important, but there's another approach that understands that those are actually, like, in some ways, the least important part. And the most important part, this other Jewish worldview says, is actually the engagement to, what reinterpreting the halacha, or trying to understand why that's a halacha, or whatever it is. And I do think that this represents two sides of the Jewish mind. But look, I mean, there is also something that's while this teaching is a surprising rereading of the Mishnah, there's also something that's very not surprising about this, which is another way to look at what he's saying here is that that the more God is viewed as the other who can satisfy my wishes, whether they're very lowly wishes or they're elevated wishes to, like, help me become higher or closer to you. As long as you're doing that, you're at a limited lower level, because you're emphasizing the separateness of the prayer and Hashem. But the more that we look at it as a flow relationship of, in which we're a dialogical partner, then the closer you actually get to God, because then the boundary between self and other begins to diminish a little bit. Okay, onward. Okay, so actually, I did actually want to look at the very next one, in which he says something a little bit like that. I'll let you take a look at it. Okay, so the first thing is just this received tradition, which comes from, I think originally comes from Zohar. Yeah, it comes from the Zohar, in which Shekhinah is called tefillah. Shekhinah is one of the names for Shekhinah is tefillah, which means prayer. And I'd have to look in. I won't do it now. Well, I might do it now on the slide, but I'd have to look in Gates of Light and see if that's one of the names for Shekhinah or Malchut in Gates of Light, whether it's there or whether the source is only later in the Zohar. But in any event, that's the first thing, just to think about that. I mean, that alone is already just a beautiful teaching that could transform your prayer. And that's not even the Baal Shem Tov, that's this earlier source. That when we say, what is Shekhinah? Like, what do we mean when we refer to, like, God touching the created world in some way? Well, Shekhinah is tefillah, when human beings are in a prayer state. And I think this refers to more than just like showing up with your arms folded in the back of the chapel or the back of the Zoom room, but he's talking about like really when you're in tefillah at a higher level, that's Shekhinah. Then you're touching the divine presence. When the Jewish community, when or prayers are connecting to the divine through prayer, that's where you see Shekhinah. That's, so it's not some unknowable mystery, or it's not just some random idea that the Kabbalists came up with. It's a real thing, and we've experienced it in prayer. That's when you touch Shekhinah, and Shekhinah manifests when we're praying. Anyway, so that's part of it, but uh, but really, when he but then what he says is, if you're praying for your own benefit, then it's hopeless. You can't really connect, because then there's a mavdil, a masach. If I think I have the Hebrew right. Got so many books around me here. What number is that? That's 111. Give me one moment here. I think it's masach and mavdil, where the phrase is, a masach is a screen, and a mavdil comes from the word lahavdil, to make a separation. Yeah, masach mavdil. So masach is a screen of some kind. So as long as you're praying, he says, for your material benefit, that's, you're creating a division. But I think that the word material in Hebrew, material in English usually makes us think of, like I'm praying for a car or a new guitar or a motorcycle. And I'm guessing most of us probably are not, that's probably not where we go in prayer. I think we're a relatively evolved group. I'm guessing most of you are not going in there asking for $1 million. But that's what the word material conveys. But the word in Hebrew is gashmi'i. And gashmi'i also means material, but it has, it's a little bit broader. And I would say that gashmi'i even includes the world of ego, right? So as long as your prayer is focused on you, even if it's, I want to acquire more wisdom, or I want the feeling of coming close to God, that too is the world of Gashmi. And as long as we do that, we are making a screen and a mavdil. It's not that God is punishing us with that, but that's, we're creating our own poison in seeking medicine. So attempt, the one of the themes that comes up, I'll get you in 1 second, again and again and again, if not like the core theme in all of the chapters, is simply the idea of ego, and approaching God through an ego state is going to be limited, and the Besh wants us to divest ourselves of that if we want to really experience Hashem. And
So many of our prayers are worded that way, and we are not the authors of those prayers. So if by
right,
praying to be brought closer to God, we're really just pointing out our distance from God, what is our alternative?
right. That's a great question. I mean, it's a real. I think it's a real. Now, listen. I think there is a Kabbalistic answer to that, and in fact, towards the end of the chapter, he has a take on Ein Kelohenu, a line from Ein Kelohenu, which kind of addresses this. But and the Zohar looks at like the phrase Baruch Atah, that Baruch actually means, it refers to a berech, like a spring, like we're acknowledging God as the source of all things. When we say Atah, we're coming, that word designates a certain intimacy, all this stuff. But I think at the end of the day, the way I see this honestly is that we have different dimensions of the tradition. Or different aspects of maybe you could say the same idea articulated differently over time. And Jewish prayer is very, very complicated, because I think it really does offer these. I mean, it would be silly to say that the prayer book is obviously about egolessness. I mean, it just would be ridiculous to say that, because it's like so clearly on the Pshat level so much about petitioner and petitioned, and affirming that difference, even when prayer is accomplished. But this is so that's my answer. And a Kabbalist would go bananas for my even having said that, because they would say you're misleading people. That's really what the prayer book is essentially about. Now, what they might say, and Harvey, then I'll get you. What somebody might say is, well, yeah, the Siddur is that way because most people can't be at the level of egolessness. Most people can't touch that. And we want to still affirm the fact that God is a source of comfort, that you can pray to God, and there's value in that. But the prayer book is simultaneously, like a pathway towards the truest essence of Hashem. And it just has to be understood correctly. Harvey.
So it comes down to the question of how do you achieve divakut? How do you achieve cleaving to God through the prayer service?
For this part, well, for the Baal Shem Tov, in this part of the Baal Shem Tov's work, that is the focus. That's right. Now because again, we're this is not the only thing the Baal Shem talked about, but we're now in however many sessions, 9 sessions into this book, which is about tefillah. But yes, so his concern in this is, how do we cleave to God through the Siddur? How do we properly understand what Jewish prayer is really all about? Right? Absolutely. And what it's all about is egolessness.
So what's the answer? Egolessness?
That's for the next class. You gotta pay $50 and I'll tell you the answer.
So the Hasids didn't teach that, I'm not sure how you say it, but the kind of prayer where you just go into the woods and talk to God, the hitparedu or something like that.
Hitbodedut.
They didn't recommend that instead of praying from the Siddur.
Nope. Sorry. Yeah, right. I mean, I'm obviously joking when I say that, but I do think that there's, I don't know, I think many people go through this when you first start to learn about Hasidism, and you try to think like, oh, this is the real thing. They didn't want me sitting in shul. They wanted me meditating all day. And then you start to read a little more and you're like, oh, they wanted me to do both of those things. So yeah, I think that's right. So when Rebbe Nachman, who's a great grandson of the Baal Shem Tov, talks about Hitbodedut, he's assuming that you're also showing up for Shacharit, Mincha, and Mariv. And you're also dedicating at least an hour a day to Hitbodedut in addition to that. Yep. And of course, just to kind of close the loop on this, I mean, I'm obviously going to overstate the case or say something obvious for a somewhat comic effect, but to make a point, it's not like Rebbe Nachman or the Baal Shem Tov would have said, like, look, prayer is a real bummer, but you got to do it, and then afterwards you can go out into the forest and meditate, right? The whole point of this of Amidah Tefillah was to be able to draw out from Tefillah that deepest kind of dissolution of self or encounter with the divine that you might also get from meditation, right? They believed that Jewish prayer was the best way to affect that and to accomplish that, right? I keep saying that's my last word, but I guess I have another thought, which is that, look, another maybe a different answer, and I don't know if it's a better answer, but a different answer to your query about the fact that, well, the prayers are written in such a way that they affirm self and other, right? They affirm duality, it seems, or at least they're predicated on duality. And so doesn't that make it tricky to then argue that prayer is ultimately about dissolving that duality? And I think, I think it's an excellent point, but I think you could also say, yeah, and all of life is predicated on of the existence of duality, or our perception of duality, right? I'm encased in this meat cage here, and I've, my consciousness is in my ego, but ultimately I believe that that's not the ultimate truth of the world, and my job is to navigate the world where there's me and there's you, and there's up and there's down, and there's good and there's bad, and still try to feel and act in concert with the existence of the unity of all things. And so why should prayer be any different, right? In prayer, you come into it as Anne Prawl waking up in the morning in her house, and then you see those prayers as affirming that or acknowledging that, but also as a gateway to move beyond it at the same time. So it's like everything else in the world, maybe. Being a Jew is complicated. Maybe that's even the best answer. Okay, let's move on. So okay. Let's jump down to 116. If that's okay. To number 116, which is on 157. And it's bottom of 157 and the top of 158. I'll give you a moment to remind yourselves. Okay, so these next two teachings are really just kind of delving into what we've been talking about. This one, by the way, was a little confusing because the Hebrew version that I have doesn't have the first two sentences that are here. The Hebrew version I have starts with the third line down, where it says one needs to consider oneself as no thing. But in any event, it doesn't change the essence of the teaching. The most ancient one is a technical Kabbalistic term for God. Meaning it's not a general name; it refers to a specific dimension of the divine. But when we daven, this is exactly what we were just talking about. When we daven, we want to, according to the best, get to a point where and let me see if he says ka'ain or ain, where we are nothing. 1 second, let me just see this in the Hebrew. Sorry. Tzarich adam lachshov et atzmo ka'ain, or ka'ayin. A person has to think about herself as nothing, and to forget herself. Completely forget herself. And what I think is so powerful, if you look at the top of 158, where it says, as soon as you're focused on your own needs, then the Blessed Holy One is not able to become engarmented. Engarmented is a horrible English word. It's a totally reasonable translation, but it's clumsy. But I think the word is hitlabesh in Hebrew, and lo yechol lehitlabesh. So this is an important Kabbalistic concept to understand. I want to explain, and then I want to talk about why I think this is such powerful language. That lavesh means to get dressed, or it means like to put on a garment. Lehitlabesh means to become, clothed. And there's this idea that, God, of course, this is a Kabbalistic idea that, of course, God's essence is totally immaterial, is totally without, beyond anything we know that has any measure or limit or physicality. But yet God is in the world. So God is transcendent, but God is also within existence. And so the metaphor that the Kabbalists use is this idea of God becoming enrobed or putting on the garments of the physical world, it, where we can encounter God. So that's what that engarmented word means. And it's, of course, a fundamentally important Kabbalistic principle that God becomes enrobed in the physical world. And that's why there's any Kabbalah worth talking about, is because we're talking about perceiving or seeing, so to speak, or touching, so to speak, God's divine energy within the created world. So so that's one thing. And then the reason that I find this so powerful is listen to that language. It's incredible. Where'd it go? Hakadosh Baruch Hu, Ein Hakadosh Baruch Hu, Yachol, the Holy One cannot become enrobed. The Holy One cannot. Imagine that. We're talking about the infinitely powerful God. If we are focused on ego, if we're focused on ourselves, if we're separating ourselves, then God cannot become enrobed within us. And I'm belaboring this because I think it's a gorgeous articulation through a Kabbalistic lens of this very ancient Jewish idea that we are partners with God, and that there is, so to speak, a limit on God's power, right? God can't force us to be in relationship with God. And that is one of the dimensions of the implications, I should say, of the existence of the covenant. God could not bring us out of Egypt until we were ready to go out of Egypt. God couldn't bring us through the sea, and there's a beautiful teaching in Parshat Beshalach, which we'll get to next, not this week, but next week, that emphasizes this, that God requires human partnership in order to perfect the world. And so here you have the particularly Kabbalistic expression of it, that we actually, if you want to look at it in a screwy negative sense, we have the ability to prevent God from becoming enrobed in the world. But of course, our deepest yearning is to open ourselves so that we allow God to become enrobed in the world. Okay? So we can have real intimacy with HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So, I know I'm going on and on about this, but, in a sense, one can't say enough. So when the answer to how can I come close to God is you can't, right? How can I come close to God? I can't, you can't. And that's what it says in this last line here, effectively. If one considers oneself as nothing, or only if one considers oneself as nothing, then such disunion does not arise. So as long as we're thinking of ourselves in some substantive way, then we're not going to finally be connected with Hashem. Okay. Questions, comments? Harvey?
So another way of putting this could be that if one loses self-consciousness.
Right. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I think that's right. Now, I want to just say, I think one of the challenges of reading the Baal Shem Tov is that, at least for me, what comes up is this, like, paradoxically, a personal yearning I have to taste that kind of, like, cleaving to God. Paradoxically, because as long as I'm yearning for it, it's going to be hard to come by. But I think it's possible for this to become a kind of nihilistic end in itself, right? The purpose of this, the purpose of Jewish spirituality, is not for me to achieve egolessness so that I encounter God, right? The world still has to function, like. People, there's the ethical dimension of Judaism is paramount. So the egolessness is not primarily so that I overcome the rupture between me and my creator, and I have the magnificent taste of cleaving to God and the dissolution of self. The egolessness will also it's not a separate dimension, it's an extension of the same notion that egolessness should bring me into a certain kind of relationship with other people in my world where I'm still moving through the world and as a person who has work to do to heal the world and to draw down divine love and compassion into every relationship I have so that I'm lifting up broken people and I'm feeding hungry people and I'm healing sick people and I'm reaching out compassionately to people who feel that they're alone and that we're all doing the same thing, right? So we have to be really careful that we're not, well, careful is the wrong word. It's very tempting to read in this uh, to 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 imagine that an individual's purpose is just to cleave to God through meditation and prayer. But of course, that would be the most un-Jewish spiritual aim that a person could have. So the question is how to bring this sense of awareness of God's unity within all things and have it manifest in the ethical realm. And that's deeply Jewish spirituality. So that finally there's no tension between ethical Judaism and so-called spiritual Judaism, because you'd be misunderstanding spiritual Judaism if you thought there was a tension there. And
Now, I think you answered the question I had when I was reading it, is why does this chapter about putting the self aside and negating the self and becoming nothing begin with the question of seeing what's wrong in somebody else and taking it on yourself to fix it definitely starts out by telling us that we're to learn from every person, that every person has something to teach us and this is what they have to teach us. Those seemed like two conflicting thoughts when I started reading it.
oh, and now you're seeing it in a different
Yeah.
light. Yeah, that's right. Yeah, in some ways, I think that first teaching that you just referred to is actually the perfect encapsulation of that. Because when I see a flaw in you, and this is an intervention. We are here to talk. We all see a flaw in you. No, when I see a flaw in you, really what I'm saying is I see a flaw in Shekhinah, right, or something like that, in Am Yisrael, in humanity. And I'm not making the silly mistake of saying, oh, it's just about Anne. I'm saying, oh, that's a thing in human consciousness, and I have to work on my little corner of that field. So it actually is really affirming that. Lenny, did you have a hand up? Okay, Harvey.
So what happens if you as rabbi are conducting a prayer service and we get to the Amidah and everyone who's doing the Amidah loses self-consciousness and becomes one with God? What happens then?
I'm out of a job.
I mean, is that possible?
Well, what do you mean? Like if we're davening and everybody just like vaporizes and spiritually
So
speaking?
you
Yeah,
check
well,
the
you said
furnace
it
for
first.
carbon monoxide.
You said it first that it's not just you as an individual who needs to lose his ego. So then spreading out from that, so maybe
Right.
it's not going to be a universal thing necessarily, but it's got to start somewhere with the congregation. So the whole congregation loses consciousness, self-consciousness during the Amidah. What will that do?
Right. Like what's the point of that?
What happens?
Right. Well, it's a great question, because I would say what happens is everyone has tasted that for a moment. But if that's all, if they say, "Oh, great, I did it. We're done here. I can go home," and they're not changed, then it's as if nothing happened, right? The idea is to draw that then into daily life and how we're living with each other, I think.
Yeah, if I could
Lenny.
just
Yeah.
comment briefly, what does losing self-consciousness gain you anyway? If the whole thing is you don't do it for gain and you can't do it for gain,
Right.
then when you achieve it, what did you gain? You gain
Right.
anything.
That's right. Yeah. Right. Unless it, listen, I mean, if we're blessed and lucky, we really, I mean, put it this way, most people I know, including myself, don't really experience egolessness, you know, for most of their lives, right? I mean, if we're blessed, we have experiences here and there. But if we, but the point is to take those experiences and to build on them and to over time transform ourselves from them. And I look, those experiences that might come in prayer, I think are a supreme gift. And if you just try to look at that gift and put it on your bookshelf and say, "Ooh, look how wonderful that thing that Hashem gave me," then it becomes nothing. So there's language that I guess it must come in later. I thought it was language from the Baal Shem Tov, but I haven't come across it yet. But you hear it a lot in later Hasidism, where it refers to a reshima, an impression that's made through a prayer experience. Like we're left with this reshima, this impression, and I've always thought that's a very powerful image, because then it's like, even when we walk away from such an experience and we don't remember exactly what it's like, or because we're in a different state of consciousness, we literally can't really recreate it, there's still an impression of our encounter with the divine that we can bring into our daily experience.
I heard a meditation teacher talking about trying to get people to stick with it, to be in the habit of it. And the phrase he used, he said, well, I learned that you have to front load the joy, because once, people who've been meditating for a long time and they get these little glimpses of joy, then they know that they can keep going back to it.
Right.
So when he teaches people to meditate, he wants to bring that experience, a little bit of it, as quickly as he can, so that people will want to come back. So I'd like to think that if the whole congregation is going to find oneness with God during the Amidah, it's going to feel so good that they're going to come back for the next service. That is like, oh, I want to do that.
Right. That's right. Because the Bash describes it as, or all the Kabbalistic literature, as the very best thing in the world.
And they would still have to kick in dough to keep the shul running. I mean that is a joke, but not really.
Right.
Both sides of us have to be there.
That's right. Exactly right. That's right. And on the level of unity, we don't need a shul, but in the level of duality, we got to have a shul to keep the gateway open. So pay your dues. Yeah. Okay. So let's see here. I want to choose wisely, because we're not going to be able to talk about all the things I wanted to discuss. One moment here. I'll tell you what, we might move backwards here, because just to make sure we get to the end of the chapter, I'm going to leap forward here to number 132, which is on page 167. And then we might move backwards from here if we have time. I'm sure we will have time. I'll give you a second to look at it. Top of page 167. So, Anne, I think that this one goes to a little bit of what you were saying earlier. You were asking earlier about why is the Siddur phrased in this way. And I think that the Besh has a really funny answer. Funny is the wrong word here, but hold on. God, the way the citations work in this book just make it impossible. I just want to see who this is. 117. One sec, sorry. Oh, Toldot Yosef Yaakov, right? So this is this is a very early teaching. So this is, we can almost probably trust that this comes right from the mouth of the Baal Shem Tov, because this is Yaakov Yosef of Polonia, I think, who was one of his first students, or his first student actually, or the first person to say, "Whoa, this guy's serious." So he's talking about the phrase. Atahu Eloheinu. Where do we see the phrase Atahu Eloheinu? Anybody know? It's a song.
In Elohim.
Yeah, that's right. In Eloheinu, Atahu Eloheinu. And actually, in the teaching just before this, at least in my version, it talks about in Eloheinu. Anyway, yeah. Anyway, so you are he who is my God. It's Atah means you. Right, and it might naturally say Ata Eloheinu, you are our God, but it says Ata Hu, you are He, Eloheinu, our God. So it's the teaching is just taking its energy from that tension there. What in the question, why does it have that odd language? And it's if I'm reading it correctly, he's suggesting that the Atah says that the you says that there's intimacy, but the who, he, meaning he, suggests distance. And the reason for that is because if one considers oneself far, then one is close. One who says you are is really in a third person relationship. But one who understands that divinity is the hidden third person can say that God is my God. So I don't know, Anne, if that's a satisfying answer to your
That's a
point.
satisfying answer to anybody.
Why say more? Why do you say that?
Well, I'm thinking that this must be the jumping off place for I and thou. That once we start talking about what person you're speaking in and separating. I think this paragraph by itself could take us the whole day to get
right. Yeah, that's right. By the way, it does not say, I had the same I and thou thought, third person relationship. It doesn't, it fits well with the I and thou thing, but it does not say that in the Hebrew. Yeah. Yeah, go ahead, Cheryl.
So to me, it's almost like saying this is the opposite of saying that an I-thou relationship is the closest relationship.
Right.
Right? Because he's saying if you call God you, you're kind of making a separation.
Right. Yeah. If you're, yeah, that's right.
Well, that whole
in this third person, you achieve more of a unity, which I don't quite understand. Yeah, but the second person is not the most intimate thing in this reading, I think.
I think the reason
I-thou relationship can't be the most close relationship anyway, because in order to say I-thou, you already have two entities and they're separate from each other.
You have a distance, yeah. This is a very, very odd teaching because in some ways you could argue that it feels like it's in tension with other things that we've read. One way to, I don't know if this sort of deflates the teaching a little bit, but I think one way to view it is if you say, "Oh God, you're right here. Like I really feel you now. Now I'm close to you." I think maybe this teaching is warning you against that because it's saying your perceptions of your conscious mind should not be mistaken for the ultimate truth. Like you think you know what intimacy with God feels like because you're looking for that rush of experience of like, oh God, I had the best davening. I just felt Hashem right there. Well, maybe, but you don't know. You don't know that that's what it feels like. We have to be able to perceive the unity. Now I'm riffing on this a little bit, even in the world where Hashem feels distant. So anyway, that's what comes up for me with this very strange teaching. Okay, I'm going to back up. Maybe let's do one more. Ba, 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 ba. Okay, yeah, let's close. This is a good one to close on. Number 126 on page 163. This is a beautiful, beautiful, beautiful teaching, I think. Okay. So thoughts about this? Is this something people have encountered before? I was wondering if it was ringing a bell for people because.
Yeah, I had a thought.
Yeah, tell me.
My son Eli's been in the yeshiva world, and I was more in the Orthodox world for a while, and just saw how it's just so different for people who are, they call themselves FFB. So for those who don't know that, that means from birth, as opposed to those of us who are Baal Shem Tov, people who are born Jewish but returned. So I really had a
That's what we
problem
need,
with-
more distinction between us.
What?
I said that's just what we need is more distinctions.
Well,
between
but that's how it is in that part of the Jewish world. It's just very divisive. My son can't even talk to most of the people he knows because they supported Trump, because they were single issue voters, just like other people. But so that's just what I wanted to.
Yeah, right. It resonates with the real experience that you've had. This division exists, not only within individuals, but within the community. Thank you for that. Yeah, I mean this really resonates very, very strongly with me because I think in some ways this is a tension that many of us have experienced within our lives. Many Jews who take their Yiddishkeit very, very seriously are not satisfied either with just a free-flowing spirituality where they're dancing in the woods and trying to meet Hashem, or if they're just going off into Buddhist meditation alone, nor are they satisfied just with the kind of by rote, habitual Judaism of their grandparents. And so people who are, I think, very serious about their Judaism, as I think everyone in this class is, we're trying to bring these worlds together a little bit. How do I take the Judaism of my grandparents and its forms and really have it be something that actually connects me to something powerful and important in the world, to God? And it's a real difficulty to hold both of these things. I'll just be super candid with you. One of the I have many reasons that I'm stepping away from this congregational job, which has been so beautiful and so wonderful with this magnificent community. One of them is that in my own efforts to build a bridge between these two dimensions, and I'll spell out the teaching on the Pshat level in a minute, so in case folks weren't sure of exactly what the teaching is, but I think I just came to the conclusion that I couldn't be an exemplar of of the God of our ancestors anymore. Not that I reject it, and not that I don't have admiration and love for it, but I couldn't model it. I didn't want to be a model for its observance, as in my own explorations of the other dimensions of my Yiddishkeit. And so, I think that it's very rare to have teachers, and we've probably, everybody here has met Jewish teachers who really, really can do both. And those are amazing people. But there also are people who, well, I'll just say that I don't think the Jewish world needs people who are just teaching Buddhist meditation. There's nothing wrong with Buddhist meditation, but we've got plenty of Buddhist meditation teachers, and I think that often what ends up happening is that you get a terribly impoverished version of some other form of spirituality and a terribly impoverished version of Judaism. But my goal has always been to really try to represent the tradition in a full-hearted way, and to build a bridge to this individual yearning and seeking, and to have both pieces in place. And it's very, very, I can't be the person to do that. But anyway, that's what came up for me in this teaching. I just saw a hand waving there somewhere. Harvey?
Yeah, I'm really not sure I understand what you're saying. You don't.
Me neither.
You can't represent Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and Leah, and Rebecca and Rachel. I'm not clear on that.
Yeah, sure. Okay, no, right. So let's use that as a. Thank you. Let's go deeper. So the reason we say, he says, our God and God of our ancestors, right? So he's talking about the first prayer of the Amidah. Okay. The first prayer of the Amidah is Baruch Atah Hashem Elokeinu melech haolam, Elohei Avraham, Elohei Yitzchak, Elohei Yaakov, and it goes on to say, God of our ancestors. So he's talking about that prayer. So, and he's pointing out that we talk about God both as, I talk about God as my God or our God, but also as the God of the ancestors, right? So this whole teaching takes place based off of that tension, right? So he's saying, what does it mean that we refer to God as God of Abraham, God of our ancestors, but also as Eloheinu? How can God be my God if it's also Abraham's God, right? So that's the question he wants to answer. And he says it's because there's two kinds of folks, two kinds of Yidden, two kinds of Jews, both of which he thinks are good, by the way. He's not about to say, there's the dim-witted ones who like the tradition, and then there's everybody else who does the real thing. It's not what he's going to say. Spoiler alert. So he loves them both, and he thinks they're both essential. But one type believes in the Blessed Holy One because she or he is walking along the paths of the earlier ancestors. Meaning, and what he means by this is the inherited tradition, right? You go to shul, shacharit, mincha, mariv, you keep kosher, the midrashim, the Gemara, the traditions as they were handed down for thousands of years. Okay? And you believe in God because, in this worldview, because you know from your grandparents and your rabbi that God is real, and that God gave the Torah on Mount Sinai, and that God told us how to do all this stuff. And our ancestors learned that, and they taught their children, and now we're learning it, right? So that's one approach, and that's important and fundamental. But he says the second type arrives at religious faith not because they learned it growing up or because their rabbi taught them, but they arrive at it by their own, what's translated here, religious investigation. Due to personal investigation. Okay, meaning that you go on your journeys and you're seeking out God on your own, trying to establish your own relationship to God. You're not satisfied by the idea that God, it's the God of Abraham, just do what our ancestors did and you'll be fine. For this person on the personal quest, that doesn't satisfy that yearning. You got to have your own investigation. Is God real? Where do I find God in my life? And you're maybe seeking different spiritual experiences, and trying to arrive to feel God through your own personal meditation and your own investigation. And he says the special quality of the first type, that is the person who grew up with it, well, he's not talking about them as being two different, necessarily two different kinds of people, but to some extent he is. So the person who grew up with Judaism, and they're like a good card carrying member of the whatever Orthodox Union or the rabbinic, the conservative movement, whatever. They learned all that teaching from birth. They're well educated. Their parents taught them. And he says, according to him, writing in the 18th century or 17th century, that person is not going to walk off the derech. That person is not going to, according to him, we all know differently in our experience 300 years later, but that person is not going to go join the Hare Krishnas or going to move to Nepal and study Buddhism. Okay, that person's faith is sure. But the drawback, he says, is that the faith for such a person manifests by learning by rote. So the upside is that they have rock solid emunah in Hashem, faith in God and the Jewish tradition, but it's done by rote, and there's no reason, and there's no the mind isn't grasping anything on a depth level. So the special quality of the second type is that the person's faith is stronger. The person who's reached out for themselves and tried to establish a foundation where they see God in all things, and they've come up with their own method of doing that, or for their own reasons, internal reasons, that person's faith is stronger, and the love of God is genuine. It's not enacted. It's not performed. It's not inherited. It's arrived at because of a maybe decades long quest to understand what it really means to love God, and so it's real. But he says the very best is for a person to possess both of these aspects of faith, relying both on faith in ancestral tradition and personal investigation. And if you do that, he says, then you're truly on the path towards Yiddishkeit. So Cheryl and then Harvey.
I'm kind of finding an answer to this puzzle back in the first reading that we did.
Interesting.
It's
Okay.
almost like, if you're doing your self-investigation, if you're really kind of doing it in an integrated way, you're not doing it to find a new answer to like how to practice halakha.
Right.
You're doing it to be in the conversation.
Right.
So there isn't,
right.
there isn't so much of a distinction.
Oh, that's great.
In my way of looking at it, between you're doing this through faith, because the point of the investigation is to kind of circle back around your faith.
Right.
I'm also just puzzling over this a little bit. Just the idea of learning all of this I wrote, because I have never in my life ever been able to learn anything by rote.
Right.
So.
Right. Well, listen, I mean, I think, in some ways this, and Harvey, I know you had your hand up in a second, I'll get you, but I really, really like what you said about building a bridge between the first teaching and this. It's really interesting. In some ways, he's not talking to us, right? Especially when he's talking about the first kind of person, because very few of us. I mean, Joel, a little bit. You grew up in the tradition, kind of more formally. Maybe other folks did, but less so. But he's talking to people for whom this is. They know exactly what he's talking about. Like, I went to Cheder, I learned the Mishnah, and I learned the Gemara. And so he's maybe less talking to us, but I think in some way we can identify with the notion that there's a received tradition that we have, and that's one thing that's important to honor and to fold into our understanding of God and how to act in the world. And then there's the other seeker part of us, and he's saying, don't view these as two types that should be separate. Like they both have their advantages and they both have their deficiencies, and we want to bring them together into kind of like a super Jew. Harvey, go ahead,
Yeah,
and then Joel.
I see you as part of that both traditions, just as I see myself as both traditions. You grew up with a rabbi as a father. My father was not a rabbi, but he was a believer, and I grew up in a conservative tradition. I rejected that as a teenager, of course, and then I went out on my own path of discovery, and then ultimately I came back to it. So it's, both models fitting together. And I see that for you too, as a seeker and as a traditionalist, and it smells together. And sometimes when you're saying, "Hey, my ancestors were Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob," you just say, "Hey, I'm really proud of the fact. Remember me? I'm Harvey Frankel. My ancestors were Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob.
Right.
That's where I come from, and that's all there is to it. Sometimes."
Right. Yeah, I know. I hear you. And listen, I mean, obviously, I've been deeply informed and totally transformed and remade as a person by the tradition of my ancestors. So I'm certainly not denigrating it. And I hear what you're saying. You see me as a person who represents that, and I have, but I really believe that a rabbi, at least a rabbi in the conservative movement, or a rabbi as I understand what a rabbi is and should do, needs to be able to really represent that and live that in a wholehearted way, without ever closing down the other kind of person that the Baal Shem Tov describes here, the seeker, who is seeking things out on their own and on trying to create a firm foundation on their own without ever shutting that down. And I think I just I can't anymore, not because there's some like great problem I found, but just I can't be the exemplar of that first kind, and I think that and there are many people who can do a beautiful job of that. So anyway, Joel, go ahead.
So I kind of think you had mentioned that back in the 17 and 1800s, so to speak, when this thing was first drafted, it made it seem like if you were a type 1 person, even by rote tradition, you would not go off the derech. And I think when I was thinking about it, back then it was probably true because no one was assimilated. You come from little villages, the shtetls, whatever. So rote or not, this is the life you were born into. Nowadays, because of assimilation, and maybe I'm an example of the person type 1, I was a yeshiva kid. There was no, like I remember like Simchas Torah, some of my friends, families, parents really would cavil and cry and dance with the Torah. And, and my dad was, nothing to take away from my dad and my mom. It was more rote. And when I it really got me kind of thinking, and I think back was I'm friends still with some of these guys, and the ones whose family wasn't just a rote, but really had that little extra whatever. Some of these guys I know that they live in Israel, they're still very religious.
Right.
And the others probably were all like me. We all kind of hit college, discovered girls, and basically got off the ranch, so to speak. And and now you try to kind of go back, and it's that much harder. So I guess one of the questions I have is, so one, I kind of see this whole rote thing, but second, how do you become the second person to find it without an ego? How do you develop my personal relationship with Hashem if I'm removing myself from that relationship? I don't understand how to do it. I can't comprehend it.
Interesting. I'm not sure I understand exactly the shape of your question. How do you establish a relationship with Hashem and the Jewish tradition and the God of your ancestors?
Right.
If you're trying to do it from
the whole idea of Hashem is, it's not evident. It's not here for me to see. It's a function of faith and belief.
Right.
So I could just say that's what I'm going to do, or I need to put myself into that relationship to have the belief. Or at least this is how it is in my mind. I'm asking for help, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, listen,
that's that. If you're supposed to become egoless,
I wouldn't. I wouldn't. I mean, look. First of all, it's a beautiful, beautiful, beautiful question. I wish you had asked it an hour ago, so we could actually all kind of soak into it a little bit and reflect on it. And I'd like to talk to you more about it. But I think my short answer is, I think what we should say, what the Baal Shem Tov would say is, look, we're not talking ultimately about two different gods here. We're not talking about two, like the God, Abraham is paradigmatic of I think, of the second kind of Jew that he's describing here, right? Abraham is the one who, and that's why he's Avraham Avinu. That's why it started with him. There was no revealed tradition. Abraham went out and he looked around the world. He didn't have any ancestors who were teaching him Mishnah and Gemara or about any there was no received tradition. And he looked around the world and he did very deep personal investigating and, looked at the brutality of the world and how to rise above it and everything. And so I think maybe one part of the answer, and your question is too beautiful to answer simply, but one part of the answer is to realize that the God that Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob were after is the same God that I as an individual need to be after in my own personal investigations, right? I think that in some ways there is a real tension in our tradition, not only between personal seeking on the one hand and then the tradition, but between the Genesis narratives and the rest of the tradition, right? The stories of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, in some ways, I think really lend themselves to the world of the modern seeker. Whereas the world that we're entering now in the Torah, as we go into the book of Shemot and, Har Sinai and the rules and the received tradition, is in some ways much more difficult for us who didn't grow up with it to connect to, right? I mean, Abraham to me is like one of the great spiritual giants. Like if we followed his path in the world, we'd be in pretty good shape. So I guess my just to put a khatima on it, and then I'll want to get to Lenny, and then we'll have that be the last part. Joel, I just think that ultimately the question is, or the assertion is, it's the same God. It's seeking the same nourishment from the same source, and the question is how to discover in the tradition this fulfillment of this kind of yearning that we all have. And I think this is actually a beautiful way to end today, because that is why the Hasidism became so powerful. This teaching in some ways encapsulates the revolution, or it perfectly expresses the revolution that the Baal Shem Tov really brought about in the Jewish world. He recognized that people weren't really being nourished spiritually. And he said, if you understand the tradition correctly, you'll see that the God that Abraham was after is the same God that you should be after. And it just becomes a little harder for us to access it because we have this tradition. But maybe you and I should talk more later. Lenny Rand, go ahead.
Do you find it a little bit paradoxical that when you say that you're not the person to do this because you have a rising consciousness of your lack in certain areas, and at the same time talk about that there's a fundamental tension in Judaism that's about the dialogue and coming to an understanding? I know I'm out of line to say that. I don't mean to criticize you, to the contrary. I mean, absolutely to the contrary. I would almost rather hear you say, I've gotten really interested in personal injury law. And that's what I want to pursue, than to say to me, I'm starting to, like, my consciousness is getting expanded and I don't feel like I can be.
Well, personal injury law. I love that. I mean, look, but I want to be clear. What I'm not. I'm glad you asked that, because I don't know if there's a misunderstanding I need to correct. I was not saying that my consciousness is expanded now to such an extent that I can no longer, the tradition is like too small for me. I'm not saying that. I'm saying in terms of where my own practices and interests are going, I don't feel like I can be an exemplar of, of traditional practiced halachic Judaism. And I think a rabbi, I think that people deserve rabbis who can do that. And there's plenty of other people, carving paths, Jewish or otherwise, out in the world outside of that framework. But I don't think rabbis should be rabbis. And listen, I mean, I will at a later time. I'll in several more months, I'll share with people what my thoughts are about my next chapter. But I'm not going into insurance law, and I'm not going to, be a Catholic priest. I'm going to be exploring different Jewish dimensions that don't require that I be an exemplar of a particular habit. So
I weep for us.
and you're sweet. Listen, I've actually, a couple of candidates for the job have reached out to me. There's some amazing. I had lost faith for a minute because of some of the things that I heard about how many people we should expect to apply, but my faith has been restored that this particular pulpit is going to attract some phenomenal candidates. So I'm pretty excited. But anyway, great discussion. Thanks, everybody. God bless. We'll see you soon.
Thank you.
Bye.